Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. So, we're back for another episode of Strange as It Seems. And this time, cut to the chase, we're going to be talking about something called, I may have brought this up before, the Green Dragon Society. Or sometimes it's called the Order of the Green Dragon, or just the Green Dragon, and in some cases just the Greens, which is only the beginning of the confusion and distortion that tends to surround, what we're going to be trying to figure out as to whether or not this thing actually exists at all. That's question number one. And the other is whether, if it does exist, then what is it? So one of the questions that I get more often than I'd like is, what's your favorite secret society? Or what's the one that you think is the most interesting? And I have to say that when I'm asked for what's my favorite anything, I'm always stumped because I don't really have one. It's like being asked, what's your favorite color? Now, some people have a favorite color. That's okay. It's red or green or blue. I really don't. I kind of like them all. I mean, I'm less enthusiastic about orange than I am red, but orange has its place. Or, what's your favorite meal? What's your favorite food? Generally speaking, I like food. And then, because that's necessary. And then I like the food that tastes good and to have some kind of variety in it. But I don't have something that's the only thing I would want to eat. I don't have a favorite movie. Okay. I have movies. I could come up with a list of a couple of dozen that I like, but it would be difficult for me to distinguish which one is the case. I mean, which one is the one I like the best. So I wouldn't say that the Green Dragon Society is my favorite secret society, or even necessarily the one that I think is the most mysterious or the most important. But I do think it is mysterious. It is possibly important. And to me, at least, it's damned interesting. That's the main thing that I'm trying. And it's interesting because there's just not much you can definitively answer about it. And one of the things that we'll probably encounter in this episode in talking about the Green Dragon Society is you're often given not sort of one version, but two or maybe three, both of which in some way are plausible. They could fit. You could build a narrative around them, but they're also mutually exclusive. So we'll bring that up when we get there. But let's start out, in the case of most things that can be called secret societies, let's take an example of something, and this may be a future episode in and of itself, the Knights Templar. People never get tired of talking about the Knights Templar. Now, first of all, I point out the Knights Templar, well, they're kind of a secret. They're a monastic order. So it's that kind of a secret society, but it's not something like the Bavarian Illuminati or Freemasonry. It was formed under the auspices of the Roman Catholic Church, and it was a warrior monastic order that then got itself into trouble and was banned, and its leaders were burned at the stake, and it then enters the realm of myth. And so there are all kinds of stories about the Knights Templars. The one that we'll probably encounter most often in our series is the persistent accusation or assertion that there is some kind of inheritance between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry. This is an idea which, although having no evidentiary basis, has been strongly held within Freemasonry, not by everyone, but by some people since at least the 18th century. So it's a very persistent idea that's sort of become ingrained in the mythology of the movement itself. But the one thing that you can't argue about with the Knights Templar is whether or not they existed. They were real. Whatever else they might have been, or what they might or might not have been, whatever became of them, what of their later connections to Freemasonry, they definitely existed. And you can date the beginning. There is a foundation date, and there is an ending date. There's the date in which Pope Clement pulled the plug on the whole thing. Now, when you get to something like the Green Dragon Society, it's not that easy. Because, as we're going to see, and one of the questions here is where I really want to begin with this, but I've got an idea in mind, is that what we've got really are references that appear in a number of books in the 20th century, beginning around the early 1930s and continuing, well, really on up to the present day. I mean, you can go and find YouTube videos in this. That's like yesterday. But pretty much it all comes back to about 3 books in which the society is mentioned directly or indirectly. There's not a lot to go on. And it should be noted that 2 of those 3 books have no real sources whatsoever. They simply contain assertions. And the first, and as I think the one we're going to spend the most time on, was presented as a novel. You know, maybe a novel based upon something true, but in fact, not just a novel, but a 1930s French cheapo paperback novel. A kind of spy story. But that's the reference for much of the stuff that will follow. Now, something else will also work into this. If anybody's wondering, is Aleister Crowley going to show up? Yes. Yes, he is. There is a Crowley connection to virtually everything. So hang in there. Aleister Crowley will make, an alleged appearance. So everything, much of what we're going to be talking about, if not everything, will be alleged. You know, one of my least favorite phrases is, "It has been said," or "It is." Who said this? Okay. That is not a helpful way to present things. And usually what that means is that the person writing that is the person saying it, and they're trying to give it greater credibility by suggesting that they're getting the idea from someone else. Or they're presenting an idea that's slightly controversial and they don't want to take credit for having said it, so they'll argue that it has been said or so-and-so said. All right. You know, the secret spy source who sort of turned up on my doorstep and told me these things. It's probably just you. That's probably what it is. But we'll leave that. We'll get back into the Green Dragon. So the most frequent explanation for the Green Dragon phenomena, the Green Dragon Society, is that it's a case of mistaken identity. That the Green Dragon Society is a distorted version of the Black Dragon Society. Now, the Black Dragon Society, like the Knights Templars, is a very real thing. Its existence is well documented. And what was the Black Dragon Society? It was a militant, violent, semi-criminal Japanese ultra-nationalist society that functioned from around the beginning of the 20th century up until the end of World War II. And of course, there's some who argue that it's still around, which is a possibility. But the Black Dragon, or Kokurukai, the Black Dragon Society, whose members are also sometimes referred to as the Black Dragons, it itself is the Black Dragon, was very real. And it came into existence around 1900, basically as a refined version of an earlier ultra-nationalist secret society called Genyosha, the Dark Ocean Society. Yeah, these guys really know how to pick intimidating names for things. The mastermind behind both of those was a fellow by the name of Mitsuru Toyama. In some ways, what the Black Dragon represented and Toyama represented was the old Japanese, the pre-Meiji Japanese samurai class trying to redefine itself in the new order. So we don't want to go into a whole thing in Japanese history, but in the beginning of the 1850s, there's a thing called the Meiji Restoration. Japan modernized, and as a process of that modernization, there was a social realignment where, you know what, we're going to have a regular army. We don't need a land-owning warrior aristocracy anymore. We don't need this warrior class, the samurais. The samurais didn't like that. I think there's a whole Tom Cruise movie where he joins the angry samurai.
Oh.
Is that okay?
That's like, well, yeah. Is it? It's when we open up Japan, and he's supposed to be like a naval.
He's an American who's brought in to try to, I think, train the Imperial Army. The samurais lose.
Yeah.
Okay. Even in the movie, they eventually do.
Is this the period of the Ronin? Like all the so many Japanese cult films about, the Ronin fighting demons.
Well, those are like their version of errant knights. I think those
go.
They were always.
Those were
a lot of these guys apparently weren't really samurai. That was a particular social group. They were more often, at least was explained to me, commoners who could use weapons and essentially either became sort of cops or bandits.
Okay.
That's a gross oversimplification of the whole thing. But so the samurai class is displaced. And Toyama and others who tended to gather around things like the Green Dragon Society were trying to find, they'd tried rebelling against the new order and that didn't work. So you're a warrior aristocracy and you've now been replaced by a regular army and you cannot really change the course of events. So you'd better sort of go with the flow. And that meant that they attached a completely religious devotion to the emperor. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's all they wanted. Well, actually, they wanted the emperor to empower them to run things. And the other thing, which of course would restore their position in a way, what would a warrior aristocracy want? What's their place? What do they do?
To fight battles?
They fight, okay. And therefore, wars is what they would want. So how are we going to get wars? Well, Japan, and this is where you get the beginnings of the whole sort of Japanese divine race, Greater East Asia Japan, the Japanese are a divine race and it is their destiny to rule Asia. This is the murky swamp that whole idea grows out of. And eventually their ideas, if not the Black Dragon Society itself, but the influence of its ideology will eventually be what brings Japan into World War II, which brings it to ultimately this national catastrophe.
So Meiji Restoration happens before the Russo-Japanese War, right? So this is, what was it, 1890, 1880? I'm just...
Well, I think the Dark Ocean, the Genyosha was formed, I think, in the 1880s, and the Black Dragon Society, I think around 1901.
Okay.
All right. Those dates aren't exact, but it grows out of that. But the Black Dragon Society, in many ways, makes its debut as a force during the Russo-Japanese War.
Okay.
So keep in mind, it's not a part of the regular Japanese military, even though there are military officers who become a part of it. It becomes very influential in military circles. And as part of this envisioned Japanese empire, one of the things that the Black Dragon Society was very, very interested in fact, the reason why that name was chosen was Manchuria. So Manchuria at the beginning of the 20th century was at that time a relatively sparsely populated, mineral-rich province of northeastern China, directly abutting Russian Siberia. So it shares this long border with Russia. It also borders Korea, and of course is a gateway into China proper. So the term Black Dragon Society, Kokurukai, which I'm sure I've mispronounced, but Kokurukai, the Black Dragon, where does that name come from? It comes from what is otherwise called the Amur River. So if you look at a map and you find Manchuria, if you look at it today and you find China and Russia, you will notice that the border between Chinese Manchuria and Russian Siberia is largely defined by the Amur River. But to the Japanese, this is the Black Dragon River. And so the Black Dragon Society, they choose the name of this river, was a kind of tip-off to what their main interest was at the time, which was gaining Japanese control of Manchuria. And that meant that the Russians, who were the competitors for Manchuria, had to be defeated. So I think it's reasonable to argue that the Black Dragon Society played a role in influencing Japan's decision to go to war in Manchuria in 1904. And then they also played a role in the ground in running a kind of dirty war or special ops on the side. Yeah. So the Black Dragons basically created a system of sabotage and espionage. This was they would hire Manchurian bandits to raid Russian supply convoys. In fact, one of the things that the Black Dragons would do quite successfully is they became, and this is post 1904 and 1905, into the 20s, into the 30s, even up to World War II, arguably after, the Black Dragon Society became this connection between the Japanese underworld, the Yakuza, the criminal element, and then also the emerging industrial elite, the Zaibatsus.
Interesting.
Sort of the Japanese Wall Street, because they needed money, and they're not really getting money from the government. So they're financed both through their connections with the criminal underworld and with the Zaibatsus, with the industrial underworld, if you want to think of it that way. And that gives them a fair amount of leverage. And there is, of course, from an historical standpoint, a great deal of uncertainty and argument over exactly how influential the Black Dragon Society was in the early 20th century. And that goes from arguing that they were extremely important and that they more and more shaped Japanese imperial and essentially expansionist policies, which I tend to agree with, to those who argue that, no, these were just a bunch of guys who were out there not doing anything. They were of no real significance. And why can you say that? Because there's no real documented history of what they're doing. And this, again, is not what groups like this do.
Yeah.
Remember, most things that have ever happened, most of history, was never recorded. Never. There's no record of most of the things that most people ever did. There's only a little smattering, what someone thought was useful to note at that particular time. When a monk was keeping a medieval chronicle, they didn't write down every single thing. They wrote down the things that they thought at that point in time mattered. So while the importance of the Black Dragon Society is open to question, its existence is not. And it also is a good example of how a secretive, agenda-driven society can exist, and the kind of influence that it can have. So you can argue over how much influence was there, but you can't really argue that there was some influence. So, to get back to the Green Dragon Society, there's an argument, well, the Green Dragon Society is just some sort of confusion. Somebody got their wires crossed and they got the colors wrong, and that's all that it actually is. And that seems like a pretty good explanation, but there is a problem with that. And one of the first problems I encountered was that there's hopefully some people listening will remember who Chiang Kai-shek was. So Chiang Kai-shek was the generalissimo of nationalist China, the guy that was ousted by Mao and essentially set up Taiwan as an independent state. The actual, or at least aspirant dictator of China through much of the 20s and 30s. So he had a number of wives or concubines, I guess is one way to describe it. But one of those women, a woman by the name of Chieh-ju, which I again have probably mispronounced, but that's what it looks like to me. She wrote a memoir about, my life with Chong. And in that, she makes this interesting statement, almost this kind of throwaway statement. And she's saying that her husband, early on, in trying to establish himself as the dominant figure in China, she recalls that her husband contemplated a completely, I quote, a completely secret system of private intelligence and considered as models the Green and Black Dragon societies of Japan. Now, why is that statement important? Because she was in a position to know what Chiang Kai-shek was thinking. And assuming she remembered things correctly, that itself is an assumption, she's clearly distinguishing the Green and Black Dragon societies as two different things. But she's also saying that they're both what? Japanese. So let's just go from that. What we have here is what she said an absolute fact? No. The fact is that she said it. And we don't really have anything to contradict it. So let's assume that's the case, that the Black and Green Dragon societies were secret intelligence orders of something, because she's saying that Chong wanted to create this system of intelligence and control, and that these were models. So that must have been what their basic function was. And again, we know that that fits the Black Dragon Society. Now, the Black Dragon Society was into, maybe with what sort of things would they get into? Running a criminal enterprise. They became great opium pushers. Okay. So one of the ways in order to control China, they decided out, was to turn as many Chinese into junkies as possible. And so they become this is where their collaboration with the Yakuza and even with Chinese criminal societies comes in handy. So they're willing to do a lot of nasty, underhanded things to achieve their greater imperial goals. And that included running brothels. It included eventually things like buying a cigarette factory of a popular brand of cigarettes in China and Southeast Asia, and then modifying those cigarettes to carry small amounts of opium, so that as people smoked the cigarettes, they would become addicted to opium and thus addicted to the cigarettes. And they really did that. Jeez. They also murdered people. Think of any kind of underhanded, dastardly thing you can think of, from drug addiction to murder to prostitution, and the Black Dragons were down for that if it furthered their political interests.
Sidebar question about intelligence or espionage. Do they all do things like this? Is it just an inevitable push in the direction of semi-criminal, totally criminal, just because that's what is necessary to carry out what you actually need to get done? Or is it just a 20th century phenomena? I can't.
Or many of the people involved in this basically criminally inclined, that they're criminal sociopaths who use the greater political agenda as a means of simply carrying on profitable crime. It's probably both of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a realm in which being a sociopath really comes in handy.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I heard something interesting yesterday, and I'd be interested to hear your take on it. One of the anthropological, evolutionary biological reasonings for why do you have psychopaths or sociopaths or whatever is basically for a tribal society to aim it at another one. So we need people who are going to do awful things to the other people over there, and we're just going to weaponize you and be able to send you over there so you don't destroy our society. But there's a reason for having those people, or that psychology present. I've seen stuff like, why hasn't autism gone away, or what? Why are all these kind of neurodivergent things still around in the gene pool? And I would argue
they have their uses.
Yeah, exactly.
People who are capable of extremely violent things, which, the thing is that most of us will balk at violence. We don't really like that too much. It's not something that most people, but a certain number of people do. All right. They don't mind hurting other people. In fact, they enjoy it. And, sometimes you need somebody tortured and you don't want to do it, but there's someone who will do that for you.
Gotta be somebody.
Of course, torture is wrong. We shouldn't do it. But nevertheless, sometimes you need information, and this person's going to be stubborn. That's how you're going to get it. So, yeah, the Black Dragon Society was full of people like maybe in World War II, a Japanese military officer who's also a Black Dragon is a fellow by the name of Kenji Doihara. And just one of the most rotten characters you could potentially come across, but very useful. Sociopath or psychopath in his own way, and extremely devoted to the Japanese national idea. So, come back to this. We've got Chiang Kai-shek's mate saying that Chiang wanted to build an intelligence system, and he looked at the Japanese Black and Green Dragon Societies as model. And all she does is distinguish them as two different things. So if we go with this idea, if we take our point of departure as her statement, then it would indicate that they are in some way involved in clandestine activities. And we know that the Black Dragon Society already seems to have things like espionage, criminal activity, dope pushing, and murder, and bombings and assassinations. It's already got that covered. So what other realm would exist? What position could the Green Dragon Society hold? Because you wouldn't need two groups doing exactly the same thing. The Black Dragons already have that part covered. So, some other dimension. Arguably, if you look around to it, a more esoteric dimension. So how can we serve the imperial interests of Nippon? Well, one way you could say would be a very physical means. Killing people, addicting them to drugs, blackmail, murder, sabotage, all of these things that the Black Dragons engaged in. But another means might be more psychological manipulation, or even occult manipulation. So it's this idea that I think we've mentioned in past episodes. It will undoubtedly come up again. The very intriguing, very mysterious, and undefinable idea of the weaponization of magic. That is, the weaponization of individual or collective willpower. It's I think recently I came across something that sort of resonated with that idea, is that the use of words to cast spells. Because whatever you speak and the way in which you speak it can have an impact on other people. I think of it this way. Someone can give a speech. Hitler can give a speech, and that in speech can mesmerize and inspire people. Mm-hmm. That is, his words will go out, they will go into the minds of the listeners, and they will influence those people's actions. And I ask you, what is that but magic? The transference of will into the minds of others to create action. So, that's not to insist that's what the Green Dragon Society had to be. But if it's something other than what the Black Dragons are, it's operating in a different sphere. So that leads into various ideas as to where the society could have come from. One of the things you find if you look around today is you can find Green Dragon, and by the way, Black Dragon Kung Fu societies. There are martial arts societies who use. In fact, at one point some years ago in Chicago, there was a Black Dragon dojo and a Green Dragon dojo, and they had some sort of beef between each other. So there were like Black Dragons and Green Dragons fighting with each other. I actually had a friend of mine some years ago who, looking at the Green Dragon Society, proposed that it was simply the Emperor Hirohito's personal karate club. I'm not quite sure why he came, but that was his, maybe that's all. It's just a guy. Hirohito got together other people and they practiced karate, and that's what the whole thing derived out of.
But I mean, isn't there a fair amount? I did, for most of these episodes, actually all of them, I do zero background because I don't have any time to do that. I run the switchboard, but I did a little digging on this one, and that I run into the French book that you had mentioned beforehand. But it seems like there's some pretty significant evidence that this was occult based, right? Or evidence is shaky. But
well, all right. So where the idea is, this is apparently a Japanese secret society, but you also find references to this in China. Here's a little interesting detail. I said that the Black Dragon Society took its name from the Amur or Black Dragon River that delineated the northern border of Manchuria. Now, interestingly, if you go south, you'll find a river that basically delineates the border between Manchuria and China proper. And that's the Chunglong River, the Green Dragon River.
Okay.
So, I gotta think maybe there's some connection. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The Black Dragon Society names itself after a river on the border of Manchuria. And if you look around, down in the south, there's a Green Dragon River that defines another border.
Yeah.
I don't know. Was it they split Manchuria between them? Could it be as simple as that? Or one way it's been proposed is that the Black Dragon Society, in choosing that river, was basically focusing its antagonism on Russia. Remember, it formed at a time in which Russia was the competitor for Japan with Manchuria. And the Green Dragon River being at the other side, separating Manchuria from China proper, maybe that was more the focus of the Green Dragon Society was on China itself, because controlling China is the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
That's something that the Black Dragons understood. Manchuria is just the first step. That's simply gaining a foothold on the Asian mainland. And then from there, the ultimate goal will be the conquest and subjugation of China for the greater empire. And notice that's how things developed. So, on the other hand, you've got some people who argue that the green dragon is a motif, and dragons apparently come in all colors. Green, this isn't something that just appeared there, as soon as people started drawing dragons, some of them were green. So if you look in China, you find a lot more references to green dragons than you do in Japan.
Yeah.
And for instance, there is a green dragon monastery in Xi'an. I think it's a Taoist monastery. I don't remember if it's a Taoist or a Buddhist monastery. I'm sorry. It's one of those two. And by the way, Chiang Kai-shek actually spent time there for a while. He actually stayed in that place. So there are various green or even green dragon societies that have cropped up in China, some of them connected to Buddhism. Remember the Buddhism began in India and then spread to Tibet and then China, and from there to Japan. And the Tibetan angle is also going to play a role. The Zhug, or the green dragon, is a kind of powerful symbol in Tibetan mysticism, much of which predates Buddhism. A lot of things everything sort of incorporates different elements as it goes along. There are a couple of kung fu movies, Chinese martial art movies that feature an evil green dragon society. I think one is called The Magic Sword. So the hero is sort of battling the evil green dragons. It's never quite clear who they are. So the term has been around in different places, in different contexts. And you can make a Buddhist, maybe even a Taoist connections. There are connections to Tibet and from there to India. But what we're looking for is some particular clandestine secret order operating in the 20th century. So, one of the first places, I said there were sort of 3 books we're going to be looking at. And the first one is a book that crops up in 1960. It was first published in Paris. And then eventually is published in English. And I'll go by the English title because that's easier to pronounce, which is The Morning of the Magicians. And you'll probably hear me bring that up in more than one context because this book, it appeared in 1960. The authors were 2 guys, Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier. One had a kind of right-wing background, the other one a communist background. And they're a kind of odd writing team. But that book was extremely influential because it introduced into popular culture. For some reason, it became a bestseller. I was too young to have read it in 1960, but by the late 60s, I knew people who were reading this book and talking about it because it was full of all kinds of stuff. And pretty much what Pauwels and Bergier did was they picked up a lot of threads of kind of fantastic stories. So this is where a lot of the modern concept of Nazi occultism comes out of this book. Even I think the whole idea of German saucers and you think it's got everything from lost civilizations to flying saucers to Nazi occultism all kind of mixed up.
So do they just
together
kind of pull all these things together? Because I told you I ran into a self-made packet basically from kind of a nutty American inventor down in Mountain Home. Mm-hmm. And it was a 1954 book, basically. He photocopied a bunch of it about Nazi flying saucers. And I was kind of surprised. I don't think it was Adamski or somebody like that. So I assumed the stuff was already out there. And it sounds like they're just...
Yeah, they just sort of hoover all of this stuff up. And then they build a very loose-knit narrative about it. They shift from one topic to another. They provide virtually no references for any of this. It's always, it has said, or it has been said, or simply proclaimed that this thing exists in some way. But this is really what stimulated a lot of people's imaginations about these things. So this is, I don't think it ever appeared in more than a kind of mass market paperback, but Morning of the Magicians is a kind of starting point. It was the way in which these ideas were taken from sort of fringe. There have been people, I think the first guy to talk about Nazi flying saucers was actually an Italian around 1950 or 1951. He'd been a former fascist bureaucrat who'd collaborated with the Germans and might or might not have known something. But that's where that idea first crops up. By the way, for any of you investigators out of there, remember that's always the thing you need to do. Go back to the beginning. Find out where this thing first appears, because it must be somewhere.
And when you're citing a source, don't cite the book that you read. Cite the original source by going back and see.
Yeah, what is it they're basing it on? So, The Morning of the Magicians brought a lot of stuff into kind of public awareness. A lot of esoteric, the X-Files was born out of this book, I'd argue. You could be mined for all kinds of things. And the interesting thing is that as best I can remember, Morning of the Magicians does not explicitly mention the Green Dragon Society. Now, I did have someone tell me that in the first French edition, it did, but in the subsequent English editions and French editions, mention of the Green Dragon Society was omitted. Make of that what you will. So I don't know that that's the case, but again, it has been said. So what Pauwels and Bergier in Morning of the Magicians really latch onto this is they're talking about a German figure in the early 20th century by the name of Karl Haushofer, Professor Karl Haushofer. Because Haushofer was a military officer. He did spend time in Japan. He was the German, or actually I think the Bavarian, because Bavaria within Germany was a kind of semi-autonomous state, military attaché. Let's say he was a German military attaché in Japan before World War I. He was an artillery officer. He was also very interested in all kinds of mystical and occult things. He was also a professor of a coin, basically, he termed of geopolitics. So have you ever seen this term? Geopolitics?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Haushofer is credited, someone would probably argue, as coming up with that term. He also is reliably credited with being the guy that came up with the term Lebensraum, living room. He did know Hitler. He did have some influence on Hitler's geopolitical outlook.
Yeah.
That, again, is debatable. But again, Haushofer is a real guy. He did have a connection. He never became a Nazi himself. And in fact, curiously, his son, Albrecht Haushofer, would, during the war, become involved in, well, he was involved in the 20 July 1944 attempt on Hitler and was executed for that. So his son became an anti-Nazi. Haushofer himself, though, was one of those an influential person on the periphery of the Nazi movement. But notice, Nazis have now come into this. So Pals and Berger basically fit Nazis into everything, which also sets a certain modern trope, doesn't it? Okay,
well, you
they have to be invoked.
Occult nationalism, 1880 to
it's like occult
I know.
Nazis. Okay, those two things get overworked, I think, and I could be partially to blame for that myself. But hey, people wanted to occult and Nazis. So Haushofer is not an insignificant character. He does have a connection to Japan, but the remark from Pals and Berger is that, and this is where it is said, as they go, that he had been initiated into what they call one of the most important secret Buddhist societies, and to have been sworn, if he failed in his mission, which is sort of somehow to bring Hitler into line with this, to commit suicide in accordance with the time-honored ceremony. And Haushofer, after World War II, he and his wife will kill themselves. So that, I don't know whether this is a result of this. So you can then, the assumption is that what they're talking about, this one of the most important secret Buddhist societies, is that that's the Green Dragon Society. Even though they don't explicitly say that. And this is something else that I've tended to encounter. It's very similar to the Chevalier Ramsay's supposed statement in the 1730s that the Templars were or that Freemasonry was essentially the heir to the Templars. And if you go back and look at what he actually says, he doesn't mention the Templars at all. He just says that somehow Freemasonry continues the traditions of the crusading orders. Well, so they're in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So now we've got they simply argue that there were apparently more than one secret Buddhist societies, and that Haushofer was admitted to these. And from that, you then get other permutations. People elaborate on that theme. I think one of the arguments is that he was only one of 3 Westerners who were ever admitted to that society, which makes you wonder who the other 2 were.
So what time period would this be? This was
pre-World War I.
Okay. That's
okay.
All right.
Basically around the same time that the Black Dragon Society is coming into existence.
That's why I was asking about when it was getting started, because it's weird to me. I mean, is that a universal kind of thing that was happening as far as kind of ultra nationalism was steering up, in the late 19th century outside of Europe, or was that a product of Japan being forced open?
Well, that takes us off in a whole different direction.
Okay, well, then don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's a bit like saying that there's a very close relationship between orders like Freemasonry and nationalism. You wouldn't have had the Italian Risorgimento without Italian Freemasonry, arguably. And you can also say that some nationalist movements had achieved their goals more or less openly, but those goals that remained, or those that weren't successful, would have to find more clandestine ways to do that. I mean, an oath-bound secret society is an excellent means to carry on clandestine political work. So we'll just leave it there. So Powles and Bergier and Morning of the Magicians sort of introduces this idea. They bring Nazis into the picture. They create some kind of, at least, potential link. Everybody seems to think that they're talking about the Green Dragon Society, though they're not. Then, 13 years later, 1973, a British writer by the name of Trevor Ravenscroft comes up with another book that's going to become strangely popular called The Spear of Destiny. And roughly speaking, The Spear of Destiny purports to tell the whole occult background of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement. And this is where Hitler basically becomes possessed by demonic forces. I think that's the simplest way to describe it, which then guide him and the destiny of the Third Reich into the horror show that it becomes. Ravenscroft is the most, I don't think he alone had that idea, but he's tremendously responsible for putting that again into the broader realm of popular culture and legitimizing the idea, sort of putting it out there in this form. Now, Ravenscroft is not shy about naming the Green Dragon Society. So here you have this, and he connects it. Ravenscroft connects the Green Dragon Society to Karl Haushofer. Okay, that's where I think he's getting this. He's either getting this idea from Morning of the Magicians, or somehow there's some other source which is being brought up. And according to Ravenscroft, Haushofer, quote, gained extraordinary gifts through membership in the Green Dragon Society of Japan, in which the mastery of the time organism is capitalized, and the control of the life forces of the human body is the central aim of ascending degrees of initiation. Ravenscroft adds that, quote, one of the highest tests of this type of initiation in the Green Dragon Society demands the capacity to control and direct the life force of plants in a somewhat similar manner to the former powers of the Atlantean people.
Hell yeah.
All right, so Ravenscroft's getting kind of out there. Now we've got Atlantis involved in it, because apparently the Atlanteans could use will to make plants grow in some particular way.
Time force or whatever.
But let's sort of break down what he's talking about. So again, Ravenscroft now identifies the Green Dragon Society as Japanese. This is apparently the one that that Haushofer was initiated into. And remember, we asked before, what was it the Green Dragons could be doing that the Black Dragons weren't doing already? Well, one of them was willing plants to grow. I don't assume that black doesn't sound like a thing the Black Dragons would have been into. But really, what it suggests to me is that I don't know what the time organism is, okay, or and this is not explained. But clearly, they're involved in metaphysical activities. So maybe this is one way to distinguish it. The Black Dragons were an order that operated in the physical realm. The Green Dragons operate in the metaphysical realm. They're involved in magic and the manipulation of the time organism. I don't know. Is that just using will to manipulate reality? So now the question is, did Trevor Ravenscroft have any idea as to what he was actually talking about? Which means we have to give a little back, who's Trevor Ravenscroft? Why is he writing this book? It's something else I would tend to remind people. People are always talking about objective sources. Is the source objective? Nobody is going to write a book on a subject that they're not already interested in. You don't pick those things randomly. You write a book or you write an article on the subject that for some reason has attracted your attention. And it's attracted your attention probably because you already have some kind of vague notion of what's supposed to be there. And then it just depends what you do with that interest. So you can engage in an objective research on something where you'd have to be willing to challenge and change your opinions and preconceptions. You thought it was this and it turned out to be something else. Or you can just think it's that and just doggedly attempt to prove that through the entire thing. But everybody's got a point of view. Everybody's coming at the subject with some kind of bias. They either like it or they don't. I mean, well, that's one of the things that would be kind of obvious in reading biographies. You can pick up on that pretty clearly. Does the author like the person that they're writing about, or do they fundamentally dislike them? Is the purpose of the book to tell you what a wonderful and talented artist they were, or what a total asshole that they were?
Well,
sometimes both.
I'll share in my own recent, dealings with doing this dissertation. I've been kind of surprised. I had to talk to a class about, just my research and just the whole process and stuff. And I had a lot of people, history, master students. Well, where do you come down on this? What's your opinion? Da, 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 da. I've had faculty be like, well, you got to pick a side. I thought I wasn't supposed to pick a side. I thought I was supposed to objectively try to lay out the facts. And of course, I'm interested in a certain aspect of this history, and I want to think that I'm going to go where the sources are taking me, right? But as you've said, there's no such thing as a purely objective telling of a history. Particularly, you're going to color yourself by that. But if you're just trying to doggedly make a point, well, okay.
Well, if you want to engage in propaganda, designed the objective history, which a lot of it, and frankly, a lot of history is basically propagandistic. You can maybe you can build these different narratives around it, depending on how you want the story to go. So that's why it's important to know who Trevor Ravenscroft, where he's coming from with this. Trevor Ravenscroft was British. He was an anthroposophist.
Oh,
he is an absolutely dedicated, dyed-in-the-wool follower of Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah.
Whose name has come up before, will come up again. And Steiner was Steiner had been everything from a, he was involved in every occult society in the late 19th and early 20th century, eventually broke away from theosophy to form his own version of it, which he called anthroposophy, a word I find very difficult to say. Anthroposophy? I don't know. However, whatever you want to put
Anthroposophical.
Anthroposophical Society. Yeah. Yes, it doesn't roll off. Maybe it's better in German, although I doubt it. Because nothing rolls off your tongue easily in German. So Steiner was a bitter opponent of the Nazis. He hated the Nazis. Well, I guess makes him a good guy, right? And they hated him. And Ravenscroft is a devoted Steinerite.
Okay.
And what's the whole point of his book? That Hitler was demonically possessed. Now, the Steinerites, that's exactly that point of view. So and I'm not saying that Ravenscroft is necessarily wrong, but you have to understand where he's coming from. Yeah. This is a person whose philosophical outlook fits perfectly with what it is that he's trying to put forward. I couldn't count that Ravenscroft is objective.
Yeah.
So, and therefore anything that he tends, but it's interesting. He brings up Haushofer again. He now identifies this as the Green Dragon Society. And it seems to have some really sort of spooky abilities. I think he also adds about the Green Dragon Society that it demands oaths of secrecy and obedience of far more strict and uncompromising nature than similar secret societies in the Western world. So he is bringing up this thing. There's something, if you notice, this whole idea is that the Green Dragon Society is Asian. Now, whether its origin is in Japan, or whether it's in China, or whether it's Taoist or Buddhist or something else, it is Asian. It is not something from the West. And that's an interesting idea to kind of keep in mind. It's the one kind of consistent theme that comes up. So again, you can argue where exactly in Asia it came from, but everybody seems to point to that particular place. And there's something spooky, and there's something special about it. So that's where most of this stuff, and things from there go in a lot of different directions. So actually, one of the first places when I started trying to research the Green Dragon years ago, I would find that the internet at that time would direct me to these websites for what was called the, was it the Delta Green? It was an online role-playing game. It was kind of a, Cthulhu,
okay.
Lovecraftian horror combined with espionage. And I think Delta Green was some sort of American secret, like, the paranormal CIA, and then there were the German societies, and it was a game. Okay. That's what it was. And one of the things which was mentioned in that, you would keep being directed every time I look for it. I would end up looking at this stuff from this role-playing game that brought in the Green Dragon Society, based clearly on the references in Haushofer and probably to Morning of the Magician. But that's where most, anybody looking for this stuff would tend, and it had a whole kind of backstory that was invented for the purposes of the game that had, as far as I can tell, no particular basis in reality. And that's one of the reasons why initially I really began to question whether there was any reality to this at all. Mm. And you don't really have that much. You've got Chiang Kai-shek's wife's statement that this thing existed. You've got other sort of references that will crop up, but there's not much to go on, and there's certainly not much objective to go on. So whatever Ravenscroft's treatment is, he's coming at this thing full bore with an agenda. And that certainly is to make Hitler and the Nazis look even worse than you could possibly imagine. What can we possibly add to this? Yeah, he's demonically possessed. All right. So, and the Green Dragon Society is almost this kind of aside. It's just something that influenced Karl Haushofer, who then went on to influence Hitler. Now, predating, if you really want to go back as to when, as far as I can tell, the first literary reference to the Green Dragon Society appears, you have to go back almost 3 decades prior to Morning of the Magicians in 1960. You go back to around 1930. So the book that I will be talking about was published in 1933. Well, it was first serialized, I think, in the French newspaper Liberté, and then it appeared as a paperback book. But the action, most of what goes on in the book takes place between 1929. That's when the story sort of picks up. And I think goes up through 1932. So it takes place over a few years throughout Europe. And the book is called The 7 Heads of the Green Dragon. And I think one of the things that may appear in the thumbnail is actually a picture from the cover of that book, which has this dragon with a lot of little human heads. And one of the fun games you can play is trying to figure out who is that. This is a drawing. Who are those people? Hitler's pretty easy to figure out. Okay. He's got the mustache and a swastika.
Is one of them, Avola with the monocle?
It could be. There is this guy with a monocle. Yeah. And that's one of the ones which I've never gotten a clear answer as to who that would be. The monocle might be a giveaway. Others have argued that it's actually a character who's going to come up, Erik Jan Hanussen, who's this kind of psychic, that it might be him, that it might be just some other monocle looks like an Englishman to me. I mean, not all of them do it. But the character looks British. On the other hand, there is the fellow who appears to have a kind of Arab headdress, and that has been reliably identified as not an Arab at all, but Sinjin Philby, Kim Philby's father. Oh shit! Yeah, who was a British agent among the Arabs and influenced Ibn Saud in particular. But yeah, that's. I wish I could remember his whole name, but he's Kim Philby's father.
Interesting.
A controversial figure, and so does that mean he's part of the Green Dragon? Because the number of people within the Green Dragon, according to this book, there are 72 leaders. They are the 72 unknown masters of this society, and there's only 7 there. The fellow with the fez, the very tall hat, is Basil Zaharov, who is a Greek, an Ottoman Greek born arms manufacturer, man of mystery, merchant of death. That's generally what he's known by. First billionaire who made his money off blood money. Okay. There's another guy that looks like some sort of Renaissance figure. Somebody thought that was Nostradamus. I don't know who that is.
There's one I thought was Marx because he has a giant beard, but
that's Rasputin.
Oh, really?
Okay, it's not a very. And that's the thing. It doesn't really look that much like Rasputin.
Yeah.
But, well, that's the assumption. So, 7 heads of the green dragons. Les sept têtes du dragon vert. Okay, I'm just going to call it the green dragon. Now, it comes out of a fairly reputable publishing house. And in fact, it's the last in a whole series of books sort of devoted to a combination, sort of spy stories. And get some background to it. The key figure in Seven Heads of the Green Dragon, and this is curious for a French spy novel, will be an English spy. And the French had a rather complicated French intelligence had a complicated relationship with British intelligence. They did not necessarily work very well together. And I'd say particularly in the interwar period, there was an outright paranoid distrust in French official circles towards British intelligence, which was seen as perfidious Albion. They've been screwing things up for us since Joan of Arc. Okay. Everywhere we turn, the damned English, Napoleon, the English, the whole business. So there was a complicated relationship there. So it's interesting that the kind of hero of the book is this British intelligence aide whose name is James Nobody. And does that sound vaguely like James Bond? Hell yes, it does. And that, I would argue, in another place, in another time, I wouldn't insist, I would just argue that that's probably the actual origin of where Ian Fleming, who was conversant in French and read these kinds of books, that was probably where at least part of his future hero was created. This figure named James Nobody. And I'm not sure the irony of that name quite works as well in French as it does in English, but from an English standpoint, we know if somebody's called Nobody because nobody has the name Nobody, there's something which is being deliberately hidden. This isn't the real name of the character. This is some kind of substitute. So what this was based on was a series which had come out from the same publishers, really beginning from about the mid-1920s. And the author of the preceding books was a fellow by the name of Charles Lucieto. And he had been a French intelligence agent in the Netherlands during World War I. He worked there disguised as a businessman, but he supplied information about the Germans from the neutral Netherlands to the French during the war. And one of the first books he wrote was a thing called On Secret Missions, which was supposedly a story about his wartime exploits. The same question exists about that as in most ex-spies books about their exploits. How much of this is real and how much of it is fiction? And it was generally assumed, even by his proponents, that Lucieto was going in the time-honored tradition of telling a story that was at least partly true, but in which he had probably changed things around, either for matters of national security or self-protection, or just because it made a better story. And it's in a... Later, he comes up with a series of books and also shorter articles in which he introduces the Nobody character. One of them has the great title, The Red Virgin of the Kremlin, which I've never been able to... But, title tells all. What are you going to come into this? Is this going to be some sort of, a nymphomaniac in Stalin's service? Yes, that's exactly what it will be. And there's all kinds of, sadism and the rest of it. And people are always being captured and tortured and escaping. It's like Mission Impossible. It's like Tom Cruise could possibly play James Nobody. So these are pot boiler spy stories. There's always some kind of mystery going on, and there's lots of strange characters, and probably you shouldn't take them too seriously. They're more meant to be entertaining than anything else. But there's also a prevalent idea that exists in Lucietto's work and in the later book, which is going to emerge, The Seven Heads of the Green Dragon, is that the publisher of those books also published a lot of material that seemed to emanate from French intelligence, especially French military intelligence, the 12e Bureau, the Second Bureau. And it's assumed, not proven, but assumed that French intelligence used certain publications to put ideas out into the larger public view. The idea that you could reveal certain things that you'd learned in the spy game, but you would then write it up basically in terms of fiction, perhaps to influence public opinion or perceptions, or maybe you're just making things up. The question again is you're not really sure how much of this is true. You know, how much are the intelligence agencies messing with the public because they do things like that? Or how much of this was actually trying to reveal, what you were trying to do is to protect sources. So if you take true elements and embed them in a fictional story, then you're not giving away where that information came from. You're protecting the most important thing possibly you can protect in intelligence, which is the real source of your information. But it interests us in the idea that there is this kind of almost symbiotic relationship between French intelligence and this and the publisher of Seven Heads of the Green Dragon and the other works. So Charles Lucietto, I think in the late 20s, dies. And the publisher was looking for someone to carry on his series and carry on the James Nobody character. And so when Seven Heads of the Green Dragon, I'll just call it Seven Heads, okay? We know the Green Dragon is there. When Seven Heads first appears in a serialized form and then later as a paperback book, the author is listed as Teddy LaGrande, a kind of unusual name. Now, you quickly find out that Teddy LaGrande is not a real person. Doesn't exist. So, who is it? It's another name which is disguising someone else. And that's where a whole little game goes on its own, in which there are different opinions as to about who the actual author of Seven Heads was. And it's interesting that one of the first people who comes up is a French writer by the name of Pierre Mariel. And Pierre Mariel was fairly prolific. He, again, was also a popular. He would be the perfect guy to sort of enlist to write a book like that. Mariel was very well versed in the occult. He was a Rosicrucian. He was, of course, a Freemason. He was also probably a member of the most secretive and interesting of all the interwar secretive and interesting French societies, the Polar Brotherhood.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the ones with their oracle of astral force.
Yeah.
So he knows a lot. I won't say he knew everything about French occultism. He knows a lot about it. He's well versed in that sphere. In fact, under another name, he also wrote this was something else. He wrote under a series of names, and under the name Werner Gerson, not like Pierre Mariel at all, he would write one of the first books to appear about Nazi occultism, and claiming, and I think this is in 30s or the 40s. I can't remember whether it's pre-war or post-war, but this is quite early. And he's really, I think I even venture to say he's the first person I've ever seen, long before Trevor Ravenscroft, who argues that there was a cult, even sort of diabolical influence within Nazism and the whole sort of background of secret societies in Germany. So he's well versed in that stuff. And, when I first began piecing things together, my first impression was that, Pierre Mariel has got to be the guy. But then, not that long ago, just a few years ago, there was a fellow in France who was putting out a new edition of Seven Heads of the Green Dragon. And you can get that from Energia Publishers, and I wish I could remember what the fellow's name was. Maybe it will come to me. But he had a very different theory. No, he didn't think that it was Mariel, but he thought it was a fellow by the name of Javier Duclos. Okay. I think I'm pronouncing that phrase. It's a lot longer. Okay. I mean, the name itself, but this is what you do in France, is that you only pronounce half the letters, or do in French. You only pronounce half the letters in the word, pretty much. And then at the end, everything just becomes, so, yeah, okay. I didn't mean to insult.
Nobody really listens.
But it's kind of that
okay.
way. All right. Just the first part of the word is the only thing.
There
that
is
has
some Canadian
clear
listeners,
sound.
though. So.
Well, they'll understand how funny modern French sounds. So, you've now got a whole system. Well, you've got a fellow by the name Javier de Hautecloque. Is what else? He is he writes on intelligence subjects, and in fact, he's one of the people who had written an expose on this arms merchant I mentioned previously. He's going to come up again and again, Basil Zaharoff. And he had written an expose on him. Hautecloque also was very, very concerned, even in around 1929 and 1930, about the rise of Nazism in Germany. Didn't think it was a good thing. He thought that another war was going to come out of it, that the Nazis, were a real danger to the European order. So he also could have been and has ties to French intelligence, even more obvious than by the way, Mariel was also assumed to have some, I don't know, everyone is assumed to have some ties to French intelligence. So what makes Hautecloque a contender is that after the publication of Seven Heads, there was supposed to be a second volume. The story was supposed to continue because Seven Heads, not to give too much away, ends with a kind of cliffhanger. Or it's poorly written because it never resolves what exactly the Green Dragon Society is. It just sort of ends. And that the work wasn't continued because, as the publishers noted, the author, Teddy LaGrande, who we know really isn't Teddy LaGrande, died. That more than that, he was murdered. He was assassinated to silence him. And that this happened in 1935. Well, Javier d'Hautecloque, in his work for French intelligence, made a trip to Germany in 1935. And shortly after his return from that trip, he died of a kind of mysterious ailment. Hautecloque argued that he had been poisoned by the Gestapo or by the SS or by some other bad Nazi Germans to silence him. So if Teddy LaGrande dies at the same time as Javier d'Hautecloque, then that is an interesting indication that it could be one and the same person. So I sort of changed my view that it was Mariel, that it was probably Hautecloque, but more recently I've come back to the idea that no, it was probably Mariel. Now, all I'm doing in this case, to be fair, is reading and listening to the arguments that other people are making and kind of weighing whether they make any sense. And this is a prime case where both of those people absolutely fit the basic outline of Teddy LaGrande. So, while I now lean more towards Mariel, I wouldn't say that I'm sure of that. Okay, you see so far in this how many things or how few things we can be absolutely sure of? We know that the Green Dragon Society is mentioned. The name has been put out there, but we're still not too close to defining, or close at all, of what it was, nor even who was the actual author of the book, which is, if anything, talks about it in detail, it's this particular book. So that itself remains obscure. But this is the one thing. This is the fact. Someone wrote it. Right? Let's get down to what the facts are. The book exists. It has an author. The person whose name is given as the author doesn't exist. Two other people reasonably fit the profile of who the author could be, which of course doesn't leave out the possibility that it's some kind of collaboration between them, although I don't know how that would work, or it's some third person that we haven't even considered. But that's just the landscape. That's what it actually looks like. So, regardless of who wrote it, the book was written. And the really interesting thing is that, well, there's another book we need to talk about. There is a fourth book in this. It's Morning of the Magicians, Spear of Destiny, Seven Heads of the Green Dragon, which is the centerpiece of what we're looking at. And then there is a very recent book called Chasing the Green Dragon by a Finnish writer who writes under the name, not his real name, of Ike, I-K-E, Vil, V-I-L. And I'd say that anybody who's really interested in this topic should get that book, because it's a very important source for what I'm talking about today, because Vil really did a first-class job in research. And I don't say that in a lot of cases of simply piecing together. He's not really writing about, Chasing the Green Dragon is not specifically about the Green Dragon Society. It's this kind of leitmotif. It's really more the history of an Anglo-French occultist in the interwar period that you've never heard of, I bet, by the name of Gaston de Mangel. And I'm not sure how important de Mangel is, but he meets and he knows a lot of people, and he's sort of everywhere with everyone who was influential, not just with the French interwar occultism, but European occultism. And he will eventually, in 1937, end up in Berlin in the presence of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. And he will tell a story. And that story will be the story that's also in Seven Heads of the Green Dragon.
How does he know this?
So this story that appears in a French pulp spy story, roughly, in 1933. 4 years later, you've got this other guy who's going to be in Berlin, and he actually sits down with Heinrich Himmler's Merlin, or Rasputin, a fellow by the name of Karl Maria Willigut, also known as Weistor. Probably crazy. But this was the guy that Himmler took. If you wonder who did Himmler sort of get occult advice or mystical advice from, Willigut, at least up into 37. And de Mangel sits down and spins out this whole story. In fact, it gets written up and presented to Himmler. Himmler will read this. He'll actually embark on a short-lived investigation, which he probably gives up on because he can't confirm anything that was said. But de Mangel, for some reason, and this is the story, which Himmler could have read in a book. There are slight variations, additions and deletions in the verbal version that and remember, to get this story, all de Mangel had to do was to read Seven Heads of the Green Dragon a few years earlier. He must have done that. But he's not presenting it as a story that he read in a book. He's presenting it as something that he has actually investigated, and that this story is true. So another opportunistic charlatan who just decided, if you're going to go in and try to sell a story to Himmler, why would you do that? So that all brings us back, going to head again, and we need to go back as to what the story in Seven Heads of the Green Dragon is really all about. Maybe why should we pay any attention to it? So remember, you got the two main characters. You got Teddy LaGrande, who is the author, the fellow who's telling the story, who also describes himself as a French intelligence operative. So one day, sometime in 1929, Teddy LaGrande is sitting around his Parisian apartment, and there's a knock on the door, and on the other side of it, there's a very insistent guy who's James Nobody, who he sort of knows as his British counterpart. And Nobody enlists LaGrande to go with him on this kind of adventure across Europe investigating this story. And the story they're trying to investigate is what this Green Dragon Society or Green Dragon, is there some sort of, a lot of weird things have been happening all around. People are being assassinated, wars are starting, the Nazis are on the rise. is there some... Now, the implication of this is the Green Dragon Society is mixed up in almost all of this. And James Nobody wants to figure out what's going on. Now, there's one of the things this is pretty clearly modeled on is Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. So, Teddy LaGrande is Dr. Watson. James Nobody is Sherlock Holmes. And he, again, is pretty clearly the central character. He's the kind of brains of the outfit, but LaGrande is sort of recounting what the two of them are doing. And I would suggest that Holmes, Watson and Holmes is probably where those characters were taken from. So, a lot of things have to be digested here. But what Nobody has, or what has come into his possession, is an icon, a Russian icon of Saint Seraphim. And furthermore, this is an icon that was said had personally belonged to the Empress Alexandra. You know, we covered this in a previous episode. Nobody much liked that one, but nevertheless, okay. Before the Romanos are all killed. So, Empress Alexandra of Russia had an icon that she carried with her of Saint Seraphim. But if you take it apart, there is this inscription in it, this mysterious inscription. And I think it's actually in English. And it basically reads capital letters SIMP with a period between each one. And the rest of it goes basically, the Green Dragon, you were right, too late. So the question is, what does that mean? And why would it have been in Alexandra's possession? So they break down part of it. They decide that the SIMP is French for Superior Inconnu Maître Philippe, the unknown superior Master Philippe. Now, unknown superior is a term which is sometimes used in theosophy and elsewhere for the kind of ascended masters, the Mahatmas. Goes back to the 18th century and the first Martinist order, which supposedly was controlled by unknown superiors. These are the guys somewhere floating around over the Himalayas or under the Himalayas or who knows where, who we get our psychic orders from. But the other thing you find is this story in Seven Heads goes on is that the unknown superiors are also the term attached to the leaders of the Green Dragon, the 72 unknown superiors. So this might seem to suggest that Maître Philippe, Master Philip, is one of these unknown superiors. Now, who was Maître Philippe? Who is Master Philip? Well, he, in fact, was a real French occultist who had come to Russia in the early 20th century and for a time had been Alexandra's first Rasputin. He was her first kind of spiritual guru. And then that role was taken over by another fellow, Gerard Encausse, Papus. And then Rasputin was only the last in a line of these kind of gurus that Alexandra would collect. And so Master Philip was the first and fairly influential, but it's not clear that's exactly what it means. There are also some sort of dates which are added to it. So there's this kind of secret cryptic message. And the belief basically is that there is a code to interpret this, that some deeper meaning is hidden within it. And it mentions the Green Dragon specifically. So they're off on this kind of adventure. And they're going to go to Constantinople, and then they're going to go to Warsaw, and they're going to go to Berlin. They're going to be gallivanting across Europe, and then to Paris, interviewing. Another thing this reminds me of, anybody who has ever seen the film The Mask of Demetrius. Very interesting movie, which has Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet sort of time. They're traveling across one city to the other, tracing down this character named Demetrius, who is some kind of master criminal or spy who supposedly is dead, but okay, you have to see the movie to see how that turns out. The supposedly gives everything away. So you got these characters. So they go and they go to Constantinople, and they go to see the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch. And he is dying. And in fact, he does. The Patriarch does die in September. In fact, on a particular day, on September the 26th, 1929. And since they're supposedly there when he kicks the bucket, we could date this particular action that they're presumably on the same day. Well, Seraphim goes into this whole thing about the evils of the Green Dragon and the horrible plots that are going on, but he dies before he can clearly decipher it. Then they find out that there's another fellow who might have a key to this, and this is a leader of the White Russian movement. Now, the White Russians are the anti-Bolsheviks, military off. There are hundreds of thousands of them. Many of them live in France, and one of the most prominent figures among the White Russian emigres around 1930 is a fellow by the name of General Kutepov. And Kutepov is abducted. He vanishes. Now, as the story tells it, you've got the LaGrande and nobody go to Paris. They approach General Kutepov. He thinks he may have acquired the other key. There are apparently two keys to this code for it to be deciphered. This, again, never really happens in the book. But the day that they're supposed to meet him is the day that he vanishes. And now his abduction was a very real event. And again, we can get that down to a precise, so you can sort of date their presence, people, by documented events, which is also part of a good storytelling. If you want to give verisimilitude to the story, you embed in it events that people can read about in the newspaper. The other thing is that later, and I mean, even into the 1990s, the ex-Soviet Russian government basically admitted that Kutepov had been abducted by Soviet agents in 1930. They grabbed him, they brought him back to Russia, they put him on trial, and they shot him. That had long been denied. That's what everybody suspected, even at the time. So that was, he does disappear. He's never seen again. So the dogged duo sort of continue this, and they eventually deduce that he has been carried away on the yacht of a man by the name of the Baron Otto von Bautenas, a Lithuanian nobleman. And he has a yacht called the Asgard, and they're sailing in the Baltic. The other interesting thing about Nobody and LaGrande is that in all of their appearances, they take on different disguises. So, for instance, when they go to see the Patriarch, they pretend that they're monks from Mount Athos. They never show up saying, we're a French and British intelligence agent. No, we're monks from Mount Athos. They eventually get themselves aboard the Asgard by claiming that they're wealthy American businessmen or bankers who are interested in making some kind of deal. And this, they decide, they don't find Kutepov there, but they find clues that he had been there. They eventually deduce that Bautenas is one of these 72 Greens, or he's a very important figure. And and they also find aboard the yacht a fellow by the name of Ivar Kruger. And Ivar Kruger he's known as the Swedish Match King. And Ivar Kruger was a real guy, and he became the closest to getting like a world monopoly on matches, and founded a whole business empire. And I think it's in 1932 that he is found dead in a Paris hotel room. Judged a suicide, but even from that point, always questioned as a murder. Here you're going to get this rich guy who's convoluted business empire is falling apart, who sort of dies at, well, for some people an inconvenient time, for others a very convenient time. But notice how, again, they're tying this to particular events. And they kind of conclude that that Bautenas or the Greens have control of Kruger. And we'll later connect this. Because remember, at the time the book is written, Kruger is dead. The audience would know that. But at the time the action is taking place in the story, he's still very much alive. But this is sort of arguing that eventually, because the Green Dragon, simply put, likes to kill people. Okay, so just about any assassination you can think of on a large scale or unexplained death, they're somehow behind this. So, at further point in the story, they decide one of the questions that came from me was, is this Otto von Bautinus guy a real person? I'm pretty sure that at some point I found a newspaper reference to him as a political advisor to the then dictator of Lithuania. I mean, nothing terrible, but there was a colonel or general von Bautinus who was in the Lithuanian military, which was a small independent country in the interwar period. And the dictator Voldemaras, and that Bautinus was connected to him, and he was connected to some kind of Lithuanian fascist movement. I can't find that again. I don't know. I mean, I could probably go through a lot of papers to do it, but I'm not imagining it. But it was nothing that suggested he was a terribly important person, but that, not too unusual. Other people in the story are real, so why wouldn't he be? So in order to get information out of Bautinus, Nobody and LaGrande, I think there's a German female agent, this kind of Mata Hari-like figure, although she was actually French or Dutch, by the name of Irma Staub. They all get Bautinus and they interrogate him by dosing him with a drug called lofulfurine, which is peyote. It is an extract of peyote or mescaline. Now, what's really interesting to me about this is that, of course, when you get to the 1950s and you get to the MK Ultra, the intelligence agencies are constantly using drugs to dose people, and mescaline, lofulfurine in particular, was a part of that. But this is a reference to using mescaline as an interrogation enhancer back in the early 1930s. This also, by the way, mescaline, or as he called it, Mexican brain poison, was the drug that Rudolf Hess, Nazi Rudolf Hess, would argue that British intelligence used on him after his capture in 1941. Now, the other thing that it kind of made me realize when I was looking at this was that, mescaline as an interrogation device. Now, who was one of the first people to experiment with that? Who deliberately dosed dinner guests with different levels of mescaline and recorded the effects? Our friend, Aleister Crowley, or to call him by his real name, Edward Alexander Crowley.
I thought it was Great Satan or the Beast. Or,
his
not the Great Satan.
The name on the birth certificate, and then there's everything else that he was called. So if you're wondering when Crowley was going to show up, this was it. He pioneered this whole thing. In 1939, when the British are, when he's on the Naval's emergency list, liable for call-up. But in fact, when naval intelligence approaches him at the beginning of World War II, they ask him to contact the branch which is in charge of the interrogation of POWs. That's what he knew quite well. He had carried out experiments with the use of mescaline on unsuspecting or even on unwilling subjects, and he had recorded that. That was an area of his expertise, and that made me think, what if James Nobody is Aleister Crowley?
When did you make that connection?
I don't know exactly at what point, but it was pretty recently. Oh, and really? it just going through, putting some sort of things together, going, and then I thought, well, how would that fit? If I was to sit down, all right, so here you got a hypothesis. You got a fictional character, a British intelligence agent, and Crowley certainly had on and off again connections to British intelligence during this period in particular. And he was, I think, of one of the few people in the world who would know something about the use of mescaline, and also probably in the case of an interrogation device. And here you've got this character using this drug specifically for this purpose. So let's go here, Crowley fans. What was he doing this period? Well, in early 1929, he's expelled from France for suspicion of espionage and just being an all-around questionable character. But, you know, he lived in France. He'd been doing the same stuff. Nothing had really changed. But I think in April 1929, his residency card is canceled. And he shows up in England in July, because that's mentioned in the press. And when he's there, he's basically taken under the wing. There's a fellow by the name of Colonel Carter, who's essentially the liaison man between MI6 and Scotland Yard. And Carter starts paying him. So what basically happens after he leaves France is that Crowley comes back to England and he goes on to the payroll.
Is this the free heroin stuff? Is this how he gets free heroin?
Well, he can register as an addict and get free heroin.
Oh, really? Okay.
But more important part is, where does he get food and a roof over his head? But
I just didn't know if that
pretty
was
much
direct support.
And I think it's British naval intelligence, sort of, they kind of protect their guy for the years it goes on, because he's going to have no means of visible support in a few years, and yet somehow miraculously he does. But at this point, but he can't really stay in England because he's still a very unpopular character. The minute the press finds out he's there, someone will start, raising a stink about it. So Carter basically brings him in, puts him on a stipend, not very much money, and then he's sent off on a variety of men. Mostly they will send him to Berlin, because that's where things are happening.
Yeah.
So, and Crowley has contacts, very close contacts in the German occult scene. And why is that significant? Because important people in German political and economic life are part of that occult scene. And so Crowley is in and out of Berlin, and this is where some of the key action is going to take place. Supposedly, he never returned to France after his expulsion, but I know that's not true, because there is a recorded instance of later, in August 1929, he's back in Paris, where he goes to see, he records that he's going to visit a British Colonel R.J.R. Brown. Never have figured out who that guy is. But Crowley goes back into France in August, which is, if you then go back to the story, The Seven Heads, we know that they're in Constantinople in September, and it's sometime prior to that James Nobody comes knocking on Teddy LaGrande's door. So, in the book, that happens just about the time that we know that Crowley, but not as Crowley, because he has to be traveling there under another name, appears back in Paris.
That would be so good if James Bond was based off of Aleister Crowley.
That James... Wouldn't it? Okay. Yes, the whole secret of James Bond is that he's actually Aleister Crowley. Then we know that in early September, Crowley's sort of called back to London, but of course they're not supposed to be in constant. And I don't think you have to make these things fit exactly, but they do fit generally. Yeah. And I won't go over all of these things, but just to say that Crowley's movement, for instance, one of the things that Crowley does is that I think it's in September 1930, he leaves Germany and he goes to Lisbon, Portugal. Goes off with this young German artist girl named Hanne Jaeger. He's always pulling along some artistic type. Okay, tended to go for those with him. And they go to Portugal, they go to Lisbon, and the most important thing that happens there, Crowley-wise, is that he briefly disappears. He vanishes, and there's a belief that he's committed suicide, that he's thrown himself into this, off a cliff into the ocean. And he essentially goes dark for weeks following this. And the general assumption is that he did this to try to boost his book sales. And then there's something that was that was the kind of cover for the whole thing. He didn't have much money. His books weren't selling well. And, it's just like I'm an artist. If I kill myself, the value of my paintings are going to go up. Well, in that regard, this was a total bust. It didn't boost book sales, and it just, it created this whole idea of him having to come up with some story as to where he was. But there's an interesting thing is that his British controller, Colonel Carter, there is a telegram or a letter that survives in which Carter writes to Crowley. Basically, before it means that Carter knows where he is, knows that he's not dead, is being touted in the press, and basically tells him, quit gallivanting around Europe and come back.
Wow.
So, Carter, British intelligence, knew where Crowley was, even though in the public press he supposedly has vanished, and he is gallivanting around Europe, which also kind of fits with what Nobody and LaGrande are doing during this time.
Is this in the Finnish book, or is this something that...
No, this is in Seven Heads.
No, I know it's in Seven Heads, but just making the connection between...
Yes, the whole story is that the connection with Crowley?
Yeah.
No.
That's you?
I did mention that to the author of the book, Icky-ville, and we agreed it's an intriguing possibility.
Okay.
And remember, it's an intriguing possibility.
Yeah.
It works great for a fictional narrative, but, it kind of works. But remember, you have to be aware of things just because they kind of work.
Well,
but none of this came together until that whole thing about James Nobody using mescaline to interrogate this person. And that is Crowley-esque.
I told you.
I don't know who else could possibly fit into that regard.
In my hyperstition, this is my buddy cop film. I want to have Aleister Crowley gallivanting as James Nobody, feeding mescaline to, people in the Seven Heads.
Well, first we'd have to get a screenplay.
Dear Netflix, please.
Okay. See how this goes. But anybody out there who likes that idea, okay. Aleister Crowley as an occult James Bond running around Europe, fighting the Green Dragon.
I see James Franco and Seth Rogen.
I can see it now. So, I really got, just it fits in so many different ways. He's in the right place at the right time, which isn't to absolutely insist he was there. But then what eventually happens. So first, let me give the sort of end of the story as it appears in the book. So, they eventually get an invitation in Berlin to see someone who's apparently a very important figure in the Green Dragon. Maybe the head of it. Nobody's entirely sure. And it's this figure called the Man with the Green Gloves. And he has this elaborate house in Berlin. And they go to see him, and this is the end of the book. They eventually get introduced, to Dr. Evil. Okay. Eventually they've made it into Dr. Evil's lair.
Okay.
And there should be some kind of confrontation. And what they see is a figure what they see is Fu Manchu.
Well, this whole thing gives me this the Phantom.
And if anybody is unacquainted with Fu Manchu, that again goes back to the early 20th century, popular, pulp novels by Sax Rohmer, not his real name, which all described Fu Manchu is the
shadow. That's
the ultimate yellow peril. There we go.
Yeah.
He was this Chinese supervillain.
Yeah.
Who manipulated things around the world and aimed at sort of destroying the West and creating some kind of... He's like the basis for Ming the Merciless.
The Mariner, I think, in the Marvel Comics universe.
Yeah, it's sort of similar to that. But if you ever see this sort of, evil Chinese Asian mastermind, that's all based on Fu Manchu. And then there's the daughter of Fu Manchu and the daughter of Fu Manchu. But that's what they run into. So somehow in Berlin, they run into this weird Asian, and they have lots of other adventures to get there. No, their key to admittance, I should describe, is a thing called a Chu Trang. I'm mispronouncing that as well. That is it's a kind of rosary Or you think of worry beads. You ever seen worry beads, kind of rosary? All right. And this is the Tibetan equivalent of that. And it's a string, and it has normally 108 little round slices of bone strung together. But what makes it important is that each of those 108 circles of bone come from a different human skull. Have to be skulls. They have to be human. They all have to be different.
Okay.
All right. And the 108 adds up to 9, which is the divine number of completion. Now, somewhere along the line, I can't tell the whole story, they've learned that the green dragon, these evil guys, they also have a Q-trunk. And this is a symbol they use, but it has not 108, but 110 skull slices.
Is that supposed to be like they're inverting or
they're the 110, that adds up to 2, which is the diabolical number.
Oh,
okay. So that's the number of evil, because these guys we turn out are Satanists. We'll only learn this from Gaston de Mangeot. So, by the way, Satanism isn't really directly mentioned in the Seven Heads in the novel, as far as I can know. But this is their identification. Now, it's kind of a clumsy way to do it, because it means someone hands you this, little rosary of more than 100 skull pieces, and you're going to have to count those to make sure there's 108 or 110. What if you counted it up and you got 109? Well, you're going to have to start over. Okay, so this is... So here's my skull necklace to get in, and we'll count all the little pieces of it. But that's eventually what gets them admitted. And I think also they're then using the disguises that they're either English or American bankers who are coming to make some kind of financial deal. Like, we know the green dragons out there. We want to deal with you. We're like the Black Dragon Society, and the criminals. So remember this kind of, the opportunistic businessmen now want to make a deal with this evil secret society. They want to make a deal with Spectre. This comes up. I see a lot of this again. I think Ian Fleming would be an example of someone who was possibly embedding real things in his fictional stories about Bond. Uh-huh. And I've always wondered that about Spectre, which, remember, is this criminal organization which largely consists of a combination of gangsters and former intelligence people, because it's almost as if that has to exist. Oh, yeah. Why wouldn't someone have created that? Well, anyway, they get in and they meet Fu Manchu, and then it ends. That's it. Nothing is resolved. So Ikeville asked a very interesting question about this, and I think it's being considered, is that if you actually look at all the clues in the book, the man with the green gloves, the description of him as a kind of prominent occultist in Berlin, I think in one case is actually described as a person who appeared, a person who kind of public magician in some respects. What all these clues are hinting at up to that point is that the person they're talking about is Erik Jan Hanussen. I mentioned him earlier. So who is Erik Jan Hanussen? Very real guy. His real name is Herschmann or Chaim Steinschneider. Okay. He's a Jew from what used to be Austria-Hungary, and beginning in the 1920s in Austria and then in Germany, especially in Berlin, he gained great popularity as a clairvoyant, as a stage psychic. And he then branched into astrology. He became the most prominent mystic.
Sure.
And he also became very close to the Nazis. Even though he was Jewish,
there's a few,
he's the guy who's, if you see these references to Hitler having a kind of soothsayer, well, that's pretty much what he was. Oh, and that's something else which is mentioned about, that the man with the green gloves could predict the number of Nazi deputies that were going to be elected in the latest Reichstag. Hanussen did that. I mean, one of the main things he did is he had a little newspaper widely read news sheet in which he made various predictions, and he, on more than one occasion, very accurately predicted the Nazis' electoral rise. He was close friends with the Baron von Helldorf, who was the brown shirt chief in Berlin, and he did, in 1932, actually meet, on more than one occasion, Adolf Hitler. And he became a kind. Now, again, the question isn't whether or not he had a connection to Hitler. What kind of influence did he have? So some people argue that Hanussen became Hitler's Rasputin, his Svengali. He taught him all of his speaking techniques, which doesn't make any sense because Hitler had been a public speaker well before that. It wasn't as if he'd been bad at it and suddenly he was good after he met Hanussen.
Yeah.
But Hanussen was brought into the Nazi circle, and he remained there until April 1933, when his bullet-ridden, decomposing body was found in a forest outside Berlin. What had gone wrong? Was it like his Nazi friends discovered he was a Jew? No, they knew that all along. Literally, everyone knew who he really was. So his whole, his shtick was that Erik Jan Hanussen, he was the son of Danish nobles. He was Danish. Well, why can't you speak a word of Danish? Well, because my parents were killed in a mountain climbing they were killed in a mountain climbing accident, and I was taken in by this kindly Jewish family and raised by them. So that's why people think that I'm Chaim Steinschneider. They were just kindly Jewish people that took in this poor little Danish nobleman and raised him up. And the whole story is just total bullshit. Yeah. And so is most other. I mean, Hanussen, in many ways, he may have had actual psychic gifts, but he was also a charlatan. He was also a blackmailer. He was running this kind of Jeffrey Epstein thing of filming people on his yacht having sex so he could blackmail them.
Interesting.
He had a large, fancy apartment in Berlin that he called the Palace of the Occult. And that was the night, it was the place to be seen.
Well, I was going to say Weimar Berlin wasn't the whole, it was like the number one sex.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I imagine a stage.
Sodom and Gomorrah on the Spree. So, or that's the reputation it has.
Yeah. But entertainment, I guess.
But everything. And Hanussen was a big part of this.
Yeah.
And remember, a guy who's living in Berlin while this is going on is Crowley. Crowley and Hanussen is like the biggest name on the Berlin theater circuit. Everybody in that city knew who he was. And he's gaining more, the German communists hated him because he seemed to be boosting the Nazis. So one of the things that a German paper basically outed his Jewish past, assuming the Nazis would drop him, but they didn't.
Wow.
So which goes back, why would the Nazis, it's presumed the Nazis killed him, but it's not because he was Jewish. The best you can come up with is that he basically predicted the Reichstag fire. So it was at the Palace of the Occult, and not long before the Reichstag burns, remember that's going to be very important because you think of Hitler, his emergency powers. Hanussen gives one of his performances and he goes, I see a huge fire. He gives this whole thing. I see a conflagration of a great public building. Okay. You make that prediction, which is widely publicized. And then shortly thereafter, the Reichstag burns down and people aren't going, you never said the Reichstag, but that's what everyone is going to think that it would be. And again, the accepted opinion was that the Reichstag fire was a false flag by the Nazis to pin it on the communists so that they could then suppress the opposition, which is probably true. And Hanussen had arguably gone a little too far in mentioning that. And that left one of two possibilities. Either Hanussen actually was a clairvoyant and could see the future. But if you didn't believe that, you believe that the only other place he could have gotten that information was from his Nazi buddies.
Yeah.
So here's a guy who is the intimate sort of advisor to the Nazis, including Chancellor Hitler, and he sort of gives away what they were going to do. But I'm not sure that I totally buy that, because by then killing him, that just sort of leads credence to that opinion.
Yeah.
I have a sneaking suspicion that it wasn't Hanussen's body. It was too far gone to clearly identify him. So it could have been someone else. But anyway, that's another story for another. But everything in the book is leading to the conclusion. And also, what else was Hanussen known for? He wore green gloves. Oh. So he is the man with the green gloves. Everything fits it. And then you get there and it's Fu Manchu. So Ickeyville has wondered that one of the things that happened is that between the time that the first version of the story appeared and the publication of the book, that Hanussen ends up dead. And that meant that you had to kind of change the end of the story. I don't know whether that's exactly, but I think there's something like that they had to punt when they got to the end, or they wanted to create an impression that was then going to be picked up in another book, a sequel, which never appeared. So that's the basic, very rough synopsis. There's more to it that happens within Seven Heads of the Green Dragon. It was not a bestseller. There was no sequel, although it seems to have attracted some attention. Again, it was just one of many other sort of pulp novels. But it was out there. And I think Vil mentions that as late as 1939, there were still, copies being sold on remainder. So it's not like it wasn't available. So now we come back to this guy, Gaston de Menjo. His father was French. He was a nationalized British subject. He taught at the Sandhurst Military Academy. Guess what he taught? French. Also, and I think geography as well. But and his son, who I think his actual name was something like Louis Léon Gaston de Menjo. The name was written all together at that point. The de was not separated from it. Toyed with a military career, but then ultimately became basically his day job, other than occultist, was a piano teacher. And he, went lots of places, met lots of people. The Polaire circulated in all of these areas. And along the way, he had made the acquaintance or friendship with a Finnish occultist. Yes, there are Finnish occultists. Named, I think, Jiri von Grünhagen. There are lots of umlauts in that name. And the first name looks like Yajiro, but I'm pretty sure that that's Yiri or something like that. And it's through von Grünhagen who had sort of teamed up. He had joined, Himmler formed this kind of, it's sometimes called Himmler's X-Files, but that's close enough. He had formed a research unit within the SS called the Ahnenerbe, sort of Institute for Ancestral Research, but they researched all kinds of things. And von Grünhagen was, I think, head of the Finnish branch of this. Apparently there was a Finnish branch to it. And he's the fellow who facilitated the introduction of de Menjo, now little de and then Menjo the last time, to get to Berlin and to get access to at least Hitler's entourage. And so that's why de Menjo was there. And he was trying to attract Hitler's attention, and I suppose, not Hitler, but Himmler's attention and patronage, which I guess would be ultimately Hitler's as well. And so he goes in and he spins out this story, which is essentially just a recounting of the seven heads of the Green Dragon, but with some interesting things added to it. Because he's telling it, and he's not telling it as he's telling it as something that had actually happened, that had been reported to him. First of all, he identifies the Green Dragons as an explicitly Satanist order. And he also notes that they have sort of bastions or little headquarters all around the world, but the two most important ones are in the Altai Mountains on the border of Siberia and Mongolia, in western Mongolia, and then another place in the far north of Scandinavia, someplace in Lapland near the Finnish and Swedish borders, but probably within Sweden. So that's something which I don't think is mentioned in the novels also. So they have these two areas. They also have some sort of base in Spain. They're Satanist, that the Green Dragon Order is behind it was behind the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in order to provoke the First World War. It is now what does it seek to do? It seeks world domination. And it's going to do that essentially by destroying the existing order. And that, at the time, that includes, in the novel, there's the idea, and it sort of fits with the Fu Manchu aspect, that there's a particularly anti-Western aspect to this. This is some sort of Eastern society which is trying to destroy. Now, you got to keep in mind what existed, what the world order was in that period. It is a world order completely dominated by Europe. Remember, Europeans had colonized, they essentially possessed everything. India was under British control. China was basically captive to the Europeans. The Dutch East Indies, all the rest of this. So if you wanted to overthrow the world order as it existed, you would need to overthrow, in essence, the European-dominated world order, because that's what it was. And interestingly, the other thing which is mentioned is that the Green Dragon Society was opposed by something, or by someone. It was opposed by the King of the World. Now, who's the King of the World? Well, this brings in something else we have brought up before. Ever heard of these lost cities of Shambhala, Shangri-La, and Agartha, which supposedly are underground? Well, there's always this whole confusion whether Shambhala and Agartha are the same things or whether they're different things. In this case, the King of the World, I think, he also has his headquarters in an underground city in Mongolia. So they're kind of right next to each other. Who knew that it was this important? So the King of the World rules an underground city, Shambhala or Agartha. Frankly, I can't. It's one of those two. Mm-hmm. The Satanists, the Green Dragons, have another underground city.
Oh, I don't.
In the Altai Mountains, and they're engaged. And in this case, the King of the World is not Satan, as you might expect.
Yeah, that's what I guess.
All right, but he's the good guy. He is battling the Green Dragon.
Did this? You want to pause? Take the dog.
Yeah, let's stop it just for a second here. All right, so the King of the World is battling the Green Dragon, and you got Demengel basically telling this story to the SS. And now, what's he trying to do? I mean, you have to think of it this way. Is he trying to recruit Nazi Germany onto the side of the King of the World, which then would make him with the Nazis, which would make him a bad guy? Does that make the Green Dragon good? I don't know. But again, he tells basically the same story with these different twists involved in it. He also mentions a specific place. He says that the man with the green gloves, which he brings up, was the sort of representative of the Green Dragon in Berlin, lives on the Königsallee, a street in the Grunewald in the district of Berlin. So he gives a street where this supposedly took place, and he goes, there's a mansion there, and he goes, that's where I think he says in 1930 or 32, that an agent of British intelligence gained access to that. Now that again is telling the story somewhat. Doesn't mention, Teddy LaGrande, but that a British agent gained access to it. And there actually met the head of this organization. Now there's all kinds of interesting things about this, because the final action in this whole tale tends to take place in 32. Remember, it's not published until 30. So it's recounting events that have happened before. And that's a very critical year in German politics, certainly. That's a year in which the Nazis, as Hanussen predicted, will rise steadily and sort of positioning Hitler to be named chancellor at the beginning of 1933. And it's also the same sort of time period where the Nazis get a lot of funding from various sources that have never entirely been determined. And, there are, of course, books, one of which we may discuss in another episode, one called The Financial Sources of National Socialism, which appeared in Holland in 1933, exactly the same year that, coincidentally, that Seven Heads of the Green Dragon was published, that claimed that Hitler was financed by a consortium of American and British bankers.
Oh, well.
No, not just Jewish bankers.
No, I know.
Some of them were, but this is the Bank of England. This is Morgan. The story is demonstrably false as it is told, but that's basically where it comes from. And then I'm sort of struck by the fact that according to Dimension, according to the Green Dragon story, that you have LaGrande and nobody posing as American businessmen or bankers.
Yeah.
That sort of. So you've got bankers, you've got Nazis, you've got secret Asian mystical order. This whole thing has everything. I'm not sure where it goes, but but the one thing lacking, excuse me, aliens. See how I choked on that word?
Well, don't turn the power strip
It's
off, though.
missing flying saucers and aliens, unless of course the Green Dragon Society is ultimately extraterrestrial in origin.
Well, the UFOs come later. I mean, they're channeling.
Okay. The Green Dragon teaches the Nazis how to build flying saucers.
So does any of this, talking to Himmler about this story, influence Nazi expedition? I forget the name of the organization, the archaeological branch of his occult interest, like to go to Tibet and things like that.
Well, so what actually comes out of Demengel's story? He tells it to Willigut. It's all written down. It's typed up. It's presented to Himmler. Himmler is supposedly intrigued and
Need some water?
I need to drink something.
We'll pause.
Is intrigued enough. Okay. Himmler is intrigued enough that he actually sends somebody out to the Königsalley in Grunewald to see if he can find this place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they don't find anything. They go to the houses. They don't find any weird guy with green gloves. And that apparently is where it ends. Apparently. Now, one of the things that happens the following year in 1938 is that the SS sends an expedition, a scientific expedition under a fellow by the name of Ernst Schaefer to Tibet, where they measure a lot of people's heads and collect various information. But one of the things that a lot of people have questioned is, was there some, what exactly was the purpose of this Nazi expedition? Was it simply an anthropological expedition, or did it have some other deeper mystical purpose behind it? I think it was probably just an anthropological expedition, but one could say, that following on the heels of this story, I think it would be more interesting had they sent an SS expedition off to the Altai Mountains in Mongolia. Now, there might be a reason you couldn't do that because the Soviets controlled that in Mongolia at the time. It would have been more difficult, but not impossible. Or maybe that's what they were doing, because Tibet is right next to that place. So it just touches upon, on the one hand, the sort of saga of the Green Dragon is one of those things that in many ways goes in all sorts of directions and ends up in none. Much like the novel itself, it just kind of ends without a clear conclusion to anything, but it does touch upon all of these different elements. And it's an example, well, put it all together, I'd say this. Did something called the Green Dragon Society actually exist? Yeah. There isn't a lot of evidence, but there's some. Again, I'd go back to Chieh-ju's mention of that. I don't think she would have just come up with it off the top of her head. Doesn't explain what it was. Was it some kind of clandestine organization, intelligence, occult, or otherwise? Almost certainly yes. Beyond that, it's impossible to say exactly what is real and unreal. And this, and in many ways, it's the kind of perfect example about what I bring up. I know, kind of odd ad nauseum, but I think it's an important point, is there isn't much that we really know for certain. What we get are different narratives that seek to explain the same thing. And those narratives may be similar to each other, or they may be completely contradictory. But that's really what we have to go on. So, you've got what's presented as a novel, a pulp adventure story, written under a name of a person who doesn't exist. We're not sure who actually the author is, that spins a rather fabulous story about the Green Dragon Society without ever giving us any kind of definitive conclusion to it. And then some years later, you've got a person who is apparently unrelated to the book or any of its authors. I don't know anybody who can make a connection between Demengel and either Pierre Mariel or Javier de Hautecloque, and that he now is presenting substantially the same story with some different twists to the SS as an actual thing. Now, is that simply because Gaston de Mangel read the book, thought it was a kind of interesting story, and just decided that's what his pitch to Himmler was going to be? Or did he acquire this knowledge from some other source, or did he have other reasons to believe that that story was indeed substantially true? Well, we don't know. But it makes one hell of a story, doesn't it?